Okay, I try again. This is an updated talk on autism spectrum disorder, and it is updated because particularly issues around prevalence and its distribution in the population seem to change very, very frequently. Um, Previously, before the DSM-5 appeared, autism spectrum disorder was called autism, and it was placed along with some other conditions that were called pervasive developmental disorders, meaning that they disrupted uh, social, language, cognitive functioning, a big range of areas. And they included Asperger's, which no longer exists, and probably people who qualified for Asperger's before are generally now in the category of mild autism spectrum disorder. Rett syndrome, which is a medical condition, and then the other two conditions on there are conditions where there is pervasive disruption in cognition and social behavior, but it's not exactly the same pattern as you would see with autism, although probably by today it would have been collapsed into autism. So, what do we mean by pervasive developmental disorder? It means that there's difficulty in a broad range of areas, and you can see this diagram. Basically, language, motor, social, some types of language processing. And when the DSM-5 restructured autism spectrum disorder, there was more attention given to the social component than the cognitive component. And typically, before the DSM-5, most people with autism generally functioned in the what we would now call intellectually disabled range of intellectual functioning. IQs generally of 69 and below. That's no longer the case. And you'll see it in a little bit as we've increasingly diagnosed milder forms of the condition. The average IQ of people with the condition has actually increased. Historically, when we talked about autism spectrum disorder, we were talking about more severe forms of the condition in which there was significant intellectual disability as well as very disrupted language function, including some kids and adults not having any verbal output. So again, a specific developmental disorder would be something more narrow, like a learning disability in reading or in math. Pervasive means, again, that it is much broader and would include things like intellectual disability, the old name being mental retardation. This is a big deal, changes in prevalence rates. When I was in graduate school long ago and far away, the rates of this condition were so low that we didn't spend much time on it. I recall looking at my textbook and it's saying it was 1 out of 10,000. And again, by today's standards, those were pretty severe cases. And I put the chart up there just to give you an idea how it's changed over time in terms of how common it is. And I'll show you some very current data. So right now, it's about 1 out of 31 kids. I have seen some figures, and I thought they were from Korea a couple years ago, that it was even more common, it's like 1 out of 22 to 25, but I could not find that again. So I think the 3.2% is, again, the figure that's generally accepted. you can see that in 20 some years, the rates have increased by 300%. It's dramatic. There's also some interesting international data. Singapore, for example, has had the highest prevalence for some time. And one time, Hong Kong was higher. And there seem to be, besides the United States, higher rates of the condition in Asian countries, and I've yet to see a very good explanation for that. It's probably differences in diagnostic practices. This is just how the condition is distributed in the US. From high to low, the darker, the more common it is. You'll see this, though, with other conditions such as ADHD. And I don't think it means that there's anything particularly in the air or soil in one state that's not in the other that creates autism or leads to autism. I think it's probably differences in diagnostic practices. We do know that, for example, when a condition becomes one of the accepted categories for special education services, the diagnostic numbers, the prevalence rates jump quite a bit. One of the more recent ones, for example, was traumatic brain injury. So the question becomes, why have these rates increased so dramatically? While perhaps our Secretary of Health would say that it's because of vaccinations, there's not much evidence to support that. And there have been multiple studies now that have effectively refuted the vaccine autism connection. I think you may have heard more recently about women using over-the-counter pain medication during pregnancy. That one is not supported either. Here is an international breakdown. The one with the highest is Singapore. You see Japan, Australia, Canada, etc. So I just looked up what Johns Hopkins was having to say about this to see if anything had changed, and not a lot had really changed. The big issue is that milder forms of the condition are now being diagnosed. I think kids and adults who perhaps were seen as a little bit eccentric in the past now get a diagnosis of being in the spectrum. When you look at the more severe forms of the condition, kids with more intellectual impairment, for example, the percentage of those cases has not changed. So again, gives some ammunition to the view that because we're diagnosing milder cases, that's what's led to this. There is also much, much more screening for the condition. And I think I've made the point in this class, but I'll make it again, that most mental health conditions are usually initially detected, diagnosed, and often treated not by psychologists or psychiatrists or neurologists, but by primary care physicians. And pediatricians who've been trained in the last 15 or 20 years have been exposed to autism much more frequently, and they've developed screening devices for it that are used in office practice. That's an example of one. I think I've uploaded it to the course, but I'll make myself a note to check. This is a kind of questionnaire you ask parents. You may observe the child briefly. But again, it's intended to be efficient and to hit upon the major dimensions of autism spectrum disorder. The problem with these is that they're not oftentimes diagnostically specific. If you do get a high score, an abnormal score on these, it usually means something's not right. There is a problem, but it may not be what the scale is for. The same is true with screening for depression, also screening for ADHD. High scores usually mean something, but they may not mean the diagnosis that the screening test is supposed to be assessing. So these are appropriately used as screeners. So what you would do as a healthcare provider is you do the screening, and then items that were indicated as being positive and items that were indicated as being symptoms, you'd follow up with and ask more specific questions and get more specific information. Okay, the DSM-5. So, as I said before, those 4 or 5 pervasive developmental disorders basically went away. Many of them were again put into the autism spectrum category. And while in the past intellectual functioning was a big deal, the categories that are focused on now are social behavior and communication. Now, communication here doesn't necessarily mean language, narrowly speaking. It can mean, and it actually does mean, a lot of the elements of nonverbal communication and nonverbal expression. Oh, we did it again. Let's see if I can get back. Well, what I had up there were the DSM criteria, and those are also uploaded to your the the Moodle site for the course. They're up there on the course page. So again, 3 types of deficits: social interaction. We'll talk about that in a minute. Communication, but again, remember, it includes nonverbals, and what are called repetitive interests, and that is being repetitive would mean, for example, I had a kid who collected the little cards that fall out of magazines oftentimes to get people to subscribe. I had another one who collected drinking straws in different stages of disintegration. And a somewhat higher functioning young man who in the old days would have been called a child with Asperger's, at 8 or 9 years old, developed an intense interest in major appliances such as washers and dryers. We could discuss spin cycles in excruciating detail. While I'm sure that an appliance store would love to have him on their staff, I don't think spin cycles are probably of great interest to other 8-year-olds. I think I've pretty much said this. One of the big controversies at the time, it probably lingers on to some extent, is that when they were going to drop Asperger's syndrome as a diagnosis, word went out in advance before the DSM-5 went out, and there was a big uproar. There were a bunch of editorials in the New York Times. Basically, people who, like perhaps Mr. Gates, who has been perhaps seen as somebody who qualifies as having Asperger's syndrome, Bill Gates, they would have a choice. They could have mild autism spectrum disorder, or they could have nothing. And while probably for Mr. Gates that might not have been a big deal, for kids who were getting support services in schools for having a, quote, disability, and that disability being Asperger's, if they didn't carry a diagnosis, the support services would go away. So these are basically the levels. Um, these folks are often, this is basically a, a level that requires fairly significant support. Um, they may have difficulty interacting with other people, not very good at reading social cues. They may get involved with having rituals. They must always take their vitamin pill before they drink the orange juice before they put the sugar on the oatmeal, etc. And if that ritual could get disrupted because mom forgot to put out the vitamin pill, we would have a major meltdown. So this by itself is generally considered relatively mild in terms of the spectrum. In between are those who require a heavier level of support and may not be able to live independently. They have typically more language problems, and really are not oftentimes terribly interested in social interaction. And they typically don't initiate any kind of social interaction, seek out other kids or adults. This last group would be the group that has substantial intellectual impairment. Oftentimes they may not be verbal at all. These folks typically cannot live independently. It's unlikely that they would be able to hold down even a relatively repetitive job like in a sheltered workshop. They might be able to, but certainly nothing in competitive employment. And these are the folks who have meltdowns, major meltdowns, including self-injurious behavior, hitting themselves, for example, or biting on themselves, if things do not go according to plan. So the formal diagnosis, that figure is probably a trifle dated. I would probably say it's now around 4.5. Parents, when you ask them, even from the point of view of their child now being 4.5 or 5, when did you first start noticing things that were a little different or that concerned you? And usually it's by age 2. One type of condition, and we talk about that, I think, in the second set of slides, is there are at least 2 patterns. There's one, and this is usually associated with a more severe form of the condition, where they just do not develop normally. They don't start talking when they should. They often don't respond to any kind of social interaction, even basic social smile kind of things. And they may improve somewhat over the life course. But then there's another group that does seem to develop normally and will develop some language and be relatively typical in terms of their social behavior. And then around 1.5 to 2 years, they regress. What they found is that at that time, 1.5 to 2 years, there's this massive brain growth, but it occurs so rapidly that the neurons are not synchronized appropriately. It's almost like tangled wires. And what you will see is that the brain, in terms of its overall size, would be larger than that of a typical child, but the neural connections are very much haphazard. Some other things that you look for in infancy, they don't track things very well with their eyes, like following a ball or something if you hold it in front of a child. They're not as interested in faces. If you compare even a child with something like Down syndrome to a child with autism spectrum disorder, a child with autism spectrum disorder spends less time looking at a face. They oftentimes don't like to be touched or held. They stiffen and pull away. And even at a pretty young age, children will show some recognition of their name. These children often do not. Shared attention. This is kind of an interesting one. And again, it usually is present by about a year and a half. It's, mom is outside with the child and they're walking along together, and mom points and says, "Oh, see that dog over there?" And most kids will alert to it and look to the dog. Kids with this condition oftentimes will not. Okay. And they often also do not do what is important, oftentimes in learning language, is point to things that either they know and they can label, or point to things that they don't know and may be a bit confused by, and that's when a good parent will jump in and give the name and label to them. And if it's something that's unfamiliar to the child, it will probably hold their visual attention longer. But that's not so much the case with kids with autism spectrum. So again, this is just a repeat of what I just said. And importantly, the shared attention thing is a social phenomenon. It's a sharing of looking at the same thing together, sort of shared experience. And again, the social dimension of autism spectrum disorders is showing up in having difficulty doing that. We've talked about paces. They are not very good at reading others' emotional states. Even children as young as a year and a half, typical children do that reasonably well. And part of it is that they're just not as interested in other people, so they're not picking up on that dimension. There's generally a preference for things that are inanimate. That's what that's supposed to be showing. Then animate. Child is looking at the clock instead of the person holding the clock. This is a task that they will sometimes give to screen, and you can see there's a piece of candy in each of the four corners. You see the expression on the person's face, and I think most of us would agree that, at least the way I'm looking at it, the upper left-hand side is what the face is pointing towards, suggesting that the child is, or the person is interested particularly in that piece of candy. This is looking at the mother. And again, it's noteworthy because we're looking at kids with Down syndrome, autism, and typical kids, and you can see that the child with Down syndrome and the typical child are not much different in terms of looking at the mother. And they do it in two ways. One where it's pretty much just the mother in the room with the child, and then the other one is mother's in the room, but there's a lot of interesting toys there as well. Language issues. What you often will see is that kids with autism spectrum disorder will make some language errors that young kids make in the process of developing regular language, but these errors don't drop out. Me hungry. Me want cookie. That kind of thing. Another thing that's interesting is, like some celebrities, I guess, they will talk about themselves in the third person. So if Eric is the child, rather than saying, "I want to go outside," Eric wants to go outside. Pronoun reversal. And echolalia, and this is generally something you see with lower functioning young people with autism spectrum disorder. They'll repeat what you say over and over and over. So you say, "How are you today, Joey?" And they'll go, "How are you today, Joey? How are you today, Joey? How are you today, Joey? How are you today, Joey?" Pragmatics is a little more sophisticated, and again, it's something you will see more with folks with what used to be called Asperger's, and that is the social use of language. Um, for example, two or three kids are talking together. Uh, a child wants to join the group, so to speak. A kid with reasonable social skills would kind of stand there at the edge and listen for a while, then chime in. Kids have higher functioning autism spectrum disorder won't do that. They'll just start in on what they want to talk about, sort of oblivious to the conversation that may have been going on. And again, and this may be, again, a little high now, I would probably drop it down to about 25%, don't develop spoken language. And as I said before, a lot of common developmental errors that you'll see in little kids when they're using language, you'll still see them at 6 and 7. Intellectual functioning, I've changed this one a bit. And you can see it's broader. The borderline range, you may remember, is the 70s, IQ-wise, 70 to 79. 80 is low average, and then we go on up the line. 30 to 40% are probably functioning in the borderline range to below that, which would be 69 and below, considered development intellectually impaired. If you remember IQ tests from when we talk about learning disabilities, there's two general types of tasks. There's tasks that are not real verbally oriented, like putting together puzzles, for example, or putting blocks together to make a particular pattern out of them, or looking at a little book to determine what's missing in the picture and pointing to it. Their performance IQ, their nonverbal IQ, tends to be better than their verbal IQ. They also may have some really good skills in rote memory. There's something called hyperlexia. You don't see it a lot, but what happens sometimes with hyperlexia is these kids can read. They're 2 or 3 years old, and they can read. They have no understanding what they're reading, but they can read. Visual spatial skills are another area of strength, and I'll show you some examples in just a bit. But as milder forms of the condition now are diagnosed, statistically speaking, the average IQ has crept up. There's some interesting research, and also folks who are just following developments in autism spectrum disorder at the University of Minnesota. And this is looking at different ethnic groups, and these are ethnic groups that you would see in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And what we're looking at is the IQ distribution of kids with different ethnic backgrounds. And you do see some differences. Generally speaking, the group on the far right, white European kids, are generally the ones who are least likely to have intellectual impairment. However, you do need to take into account, particularly when looking at African Americans, Somali, Hispanic kids, that there's still perhaps some evidence that IQ testing may be somewhat biased against those groups. This is a video link. I checked it out, still working. And it shows you the difference, particularly in young kids, between a typical child and a child with autism spectrum disorder. Social cognitive deficits. I put that weird-looking outfit up there because one of the problems these folks show is what's called the theory of mind, and that is being able to take the perspective of somebody else. And they have a test called the faux pas test, where somebody says something inappropriate, and typical kids can pick up on that pretty quickly, but the child with autism spectrum disorder, even higher functioning, doesn't necessarily. And I'll show you a little bit of this. The theory of mind, the ability to have some degree of accuracy in what other people might be thinking in a situation, is not just a problem in kids with autism spectrum disorder. It's something that sort of has caught on in the psychology field. That it's seen, for example, with folks with personality disorders like borderline. So this gets relatively sophisticated at the beginning. It's just, what would somebody else be thinking in this situation? And then there's a higher level. What would somebody else be thinking that someone else is thinking? That's pretty sophisticated stuff. This is one of the tasks that's used, called the Sally Ann task. And basically what happens is that Sally and Ann, Sally's got a ball, she puts it in the basket. Sally goes out for a walk. Ann's hanging out there. She takes the ball, puts it in another place. When Sally comes back, where will she look for the ball? Well, she'll probably look for it where she thought she hit it. But again, kids with autism spectrum disorder, once they know where it is themselves, will say it's where Ann hit it. It's not where Sally thought it was. And I've got a couple theory of mind videos. These are clips for them. I think one of them does show the Sally Ann task. Another one's an interesting one because it shows younger kids doing theory of mind tasks, and also explanation for it. It's done by, I think it was done by the CBC. It's pretty good. So again, these I checked out. They're all functioning. So we talk about social communication. As I said before, language is still an issue, but when the DSM-5 came out, they expanded it more to communication more broadly. So it includes things like your gestures matching up with your speech, making eye contact, the tone of your voice being appropriate to the context, and of course the use of words themselves. And I've got an array of these slides in here, but they basically are talking about how these deficits would affect daily interaction. So for example, kids with autism spectrum disorder may not use gestures to accompany something they're saying. They may also be more likely to speak in a flat, monotonic tone of voice that doesn't show much variation or inflection. Social interaction, I think we pretty much talked about that. Showing concern, the ability to have empathy, I think also means that you've got a reasonably developed theory of mind. Valuing relationships, enjoying social interaction. And again, I think without too much imagination, you can get a fairly good idea how that would impact daily functioning. It's going to be hard to develop, maintain friendships. And these informal, implicit rules that we use in social interaction are just not going to be there oftentimes. Being able to think imaginatively, particularly creatively, and being able to think about things away from or in addition to concrete things that are in front of you. You know, like little kids will sometimes pick up a block or a shoe and pretend that it's a phone receiver. You're less likely to see that sort of imaginative play with kids with autism spectrum disorder. And here, these are sort of concrete skills involved in that. These are not kids who are going to be at the dress-up corner in preschool, putting on a fireman's hat and saying, "I'm a fireman, I'm going to go out and save people from the burning house." Again, that's imaginative, kind of creative play. This I had mentioned earlier, and it's been given a lot more attention than before. They may have strong attachment to objects. I gave you the examples of the drinking straws, for example, and we'll line them up the way they like to have them lined up, and we'll get upset if somebody messes with them. And again, you'll see this sort of cathexis or engagement with these objects that you won't see in terms of engagement with people. This is something you may have seen movies about this idea of sensory overload. And these folks cannot tolerate high levels of stimulation. They get very, very distressed. And it can be bright lights. Probably the one you most commonly see are loud sounds, touch, being touched, or even having clothing that puts too much pressure on the skin. And I've put up a link to a video that shows a simulation of what that experience might be like for a child with autism spectrum disorder, like in a school setting. There is actually now a whole industry now on clothing for kids and adults who are very sensitive to sensory stimulation. They oftentimes don't have any, for example, basic things like labels in the back of them. There's also seems to be a positive response to clothing that has some compression value to it. And again, this has become a business in and of itself. And that is a linkage to a place that sells a lot of these non-stimulating and often compression style clothing. They're mostly for kids. Self-stimulation, this can be a problem, particularly when it gets violent. Kids may, probably the most common thing you'll see is rocking and flapping, waving their hands and arms kind of thing behavior. But there are more severe forms of it where they'll be headbanging, gouging at their skin, biting themselves. And these are kids who have to oftentimes have some type of restraints put on their arms, wear a helmet, those kinds of things. So when can you diagnose this condition? I'm a little, what should I say? A little hesitant to go real deep on this because I think there's, again, some problems with false positives. And again, some of these behaviors can be accounted for by issues other than autism spectrum disorder. But when you don't see basic social smiles, playing peekaboo, that kind of stuff, the other thing that you'll see when kids are acquiring language, even if they're not using words, but they're babbling, you know, they go ba 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 ba, and then mom will go ba 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 ba. And what you'll see pretty quickly is they'll develop a conversational rhythm where one of them vocalizes, then stops, the other vocalizes, etc. And again, the development of language, the normal development of language is probably the biggest cue that something is amiss. However, as you may remember from some of the earlier talks, there are communication disorders like expressive language disorder, receptive language disorder, that may also be associated with slower language development, or a child who's had multiple ear infections, maybe. This is kind of interesting. I said before that on IQ tests, kids with autism spectrum disorder oftentimes will do much better on the nonverbal test. The one you see with the red and white, that's called block design. And there's about, depending which version of it you give, there may be about 12 little tasks that are on an IQ test, and that's one of them. That one is often one they score the highest on. The other one that you see on the right with the baby carriage, it is to count the number of triangles that you see in that or on that baby carriage. Remember, look at the wheels too. Those kinds of tasks seem to be oftentimes what are called splinter skills in kids with autism spectrum disorder, meaning that they may perform in the average to above average range on those things, where they don't on other areas that you would test in an IQ test. We hear a lot about savantism, and this is an old movie, probably by most of your personal histories. Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman and Tom Hanks. Not Tom Hanks, I'm sorry. Our good friend who was in all those wonderful movies where he was a pilot and Risky Business and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, these are not very common. Unfortunately, Mr. Hoffman's performance gave us this notion that this is probably a common thing with kids with autism spectrum disorder, and it is not. Again, these are splinter skills. A kid might be able to play the piano and play a tune beautifully after just hearing it once, but may not be able to speak very well, may not even be able to dress themselves, that kind of thing. And so the information is segmented memory for historical facts, but not knowing their historical significance. Anyway, Mr. Cruz, I don't think that was where he had his breakout film. I think it was in those where he was playing a pilot. But he did have a pretty good performance with Mr. Hoffman in the film Rain Man. Anyway, but unfortunately, Rain Man was so popular that people began to stereotype folks with autism as all having these savant skills, and it's not that common. Here's an example of savant art. There are folks with autism spectrum disorder. There's a famous guy, I think in England. They will take him up in a helicopter for a few minutes around some national monument, like a cathedral. And after seeing it, he doesn't take notes or do any jotting or anything. When they take him back, he'll be able, it may take him some days, but be able to paint or draw a detailed replication of what he saw. Again, that's another example. I think that's from Paris. One interesting example of I always thought that they probably had labeled her inappropriately. They always said she had autism. I thought she, by the old standards, probably had Asperger's syndrome. But by today's standards, Asperger's gone, so the folks who said autism, I guess, are now correct. This is Temple Grandin. She actually has a PhD in animal husbandry. She developed more humane ways that cows that are being slaughtered for their meat in stockyards could be slaughtered. She seemed to have some real connection with these animals. And so she's a professor in that area. She's gone on to be sort of an autism activist. And what's interesting, the book about her is called Thinking in Pictures. And she said that is what happens with her. She doesn't think in words, she thinks in pictures. She also has become to do a number of speaking engagements. And she is not able really to pick up a lot on humor and things like that. and she has to write herself notes, like look at the audience, smile, things like that, that I think many of us would just do spontaneously, but they don't come natural to her. Um, uh, the book about her was actually made into a popular film, and I have put up a link to some information about her, an interview with her. And finally, here's a link to the guy who allegedly was the role model for the Dustin Hoffman character in Rain Man, a guy named Kim Peek. Kim's no longer alive, sadly. He was a savant. He could tell you backwards and forwards who each of the ruling kings and queens of England were for the past 500 years and get them in order and get the precise year. He was also one of these guys who you could basically say May 17th, 1755, he could tell you what day of the week it was. And again, it's another very dramatic example of a savant, but please remember, these folks are pretty rare.